Hello, Garland Nixon here with Harley Schlanger. We got plenty to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Harley Schlanger's a very wise fellow and a good friend of mine. He's a longtime spokesman for the Lyndon LaRouche organization. He's also the vice chair of the board for the Schiller Institute. He's the author and lecturer on contemporary geopolitics, an all-around good guy. Harley Schlanger, welcome back. It's been quite a while.
Hi, Garland. Good to see you.
All right, we got plenty to talk about, and I think the issue we've got here, we need to start because there's weird stuff going on in Europe. I'm going to throw something at you. I'm just going to throw this at you and get your comments. Okay, I tend to do that. Just a thought that was running through my mind. You know, I used to think to myself, how the hell could World War I happen? You know, how crazy do you have to be to line up all of the young people in your continent on either side of a friggin' trench and just have them blow each other to smithereens? And you didn't learn anything. A couple years later, World War II, you're marching around. This time you're going to just flatten the whole continent. And I just thought that doesn't make sense. And now that I see the positions, the geopolitical positions that are being taken by the Macrons and the Starmers, sadly to say, it all makes sense to me. These people are lunatics. The ruling elite of these colonialist, imperialist countries are lunatics. That flowed through my mind. I'm going to throw that out to you, Harley. Can you bring me back to reality, make some sense out of that?
Well, I think you're in reality. The establishment in Europe is not. You know, I've lived here now in Europe for 8 years. When I first came here, I assumed there was rationality. I knew there were some problems. But what you can see is that they've completely lost touch with reality. I mean, here you have leaders who are in the low 20% popularity level, talking about plunging their nations into brutal austerity to fund a war that can't be won, that's wiping out a whole generation or two of Ukrainians and putting the world, as President Trump correctly said, gambling on World War III. So you're absolutely right. This is the idea of sleepwalking into a world war. But they're not really sleepwalking. They seem to be conscious, although sometimes when you look at Keir Starmer or Sir Keir Starmer, you're not sure. Macron is another one of these characters who, from my friends in France, they told me that he's still smarting from getting the French kicked out of West Africa, what used to be called French West Africa. And there's a military official from the French army who said that maybe Macron wants to send French troops to Ukraine because he doesn't want the Foreign Legion in France where they might pull a coup against him. So we're looking at a situation where there's a search for a reasonable figure, certainly not Zelensky. Zelensky's a product of a form of brainwashing coming from this collapsed establishment. Now, the obvious point is there are some adults running around. And ironically, this now includes Marco Rubio. Who would have thought that Rubio would be a voice for peace? The potential of a Putin-Trump discussion may be the one thing that we have that could be a salvation for the situation. But the failure of this meeting yesterday in London, where, can you believe, you talk about brain dead, Starmer talked about the coalition of the willing. Does he not remember where that came from?
Unbelievable. Well, let me ask you this, something that, I think that you will probably be a person who knows more than most about this, or who think, because I know you and your organization talk about these things a lot and have been warning about them for years. One of the first thoughts that came to mind when I realized that, okay, Donald Trump wants out for whatever reasons, he wants out of this crap. He wants a peaceful deal, right? And I saw the British and the French kind of leading the charge, particularly the British, to say, let's keep going. We can't, no matter how absurd their positions are, they got to hold on to this, right? It seems to me that accepting the reality of what has happened here is tantamount to death to these people. And this is what I thought. Get your thoughts on it. You know, we're talking 500 years or more. You've had the British Empire, the French Empire all over the place. They're still like to believe that they're mini empires because they got an island here and there with some indigenous people around the world, New Caledonia, stuff like that. This is a time when the British Empire, when their empire collapsed, they kind of clung on to the U.S. empire so they could pretend that they were still an empire by holding on to the U.S. empire, maybe in some ways guiding it, maybe in some ways not. It seems to me that part of the desperation is driven by the reality after centuries and centuries that England's just an island on the other side of the channel, that France is just a country with some bagels with some baguettes and berets, that they got what they got. But at home, they're in economic collapse, they're in cultural collapse, they're completely a disaster. And it's like they haven't had to face it as long as they could cling on to the US empire. And now that the US empire is like, you guys are kind of leeches and parasites, and you're not realistic, we're done with you. What do you think about this issue, this desperation to some extent coming from the realization that after all of these centuries, the empire, the colonial, all that stuff is over?
Well, you're absolutely right about that. We're talking about 500 to 600 years of European colonialism. And it was, some people think of the empire as maybe 500 or 600 years ago. They don't realize that the greatest extent of the British Empire was in the beginning of the 20th century, that it continued to grow. And to a certain extent, the British Commonwealth represents a remnant of that, which includes the Five Eyes countries of the United States to some extent. But the important thing is that beginning after World War I with the Versailles Conference, the British began to have a sense that they could not continue to sustain a global empire. And they started recruiting the Americans. And this happened at the Versailles Conference. It happened with people like the Harriman networks. The Bush family was part of this. And then again, after World War II, they had the Chatham House operation of British intelligence had created the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, and recruited mostly New York lawyers, and built a presence in the American establishment, which then became the dominant presence after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, what did the British do? The British were continuing to go around the world triggering wars. You remember the Malvinas War, sometimes called the Falklands War. What was that about? It's an empire that's afraid to lose an island that they really don't get much out of. The British have a very significant control over what's happening in Southwest Asia and Israel, because Israel was originally a colonial project of the British. And people say it was the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. They were used by the British Empire as a geopolitical outpost to do exactly what Netanyahu's doing today, which is disrupting the potential to move toward a much more sustainable peace. So the problem of an empire is that when it crashes, good things don't happen. They become more desperate. There are more crazy wars, assassinations, regime change. They still have residual power, but take this as an example. The idea you're going to replace the American nuclear umbrella for Europe with a British-French nuclear umbrella. The British and the French are not exactly that close, first of all. Secondly, the British military is a junk heap. They basically rent Trident nuclear missiles from the United States. They don't have their ability to repair them and keep them online. So the idea that this is somehow going to take on Russia shows a complete leave of senses. Now, you mentioned Macron, the situation he faces. He's at 20% in the polls, and he's governing most of the last year and a half without a government. And he's trying to keep a balance between so-called left and so-called right. So I think, Garland, what we're seeing is the breakdown of a consensus that was built over a long period of time, that it's the European colonial nations that have the power in the world, still to some extent in terms of the control of the economy. They have some power, but they're losing that. The BRICS countries, the alliance of Russia, China, Brazil, and so on, India, they're becoming a larger economic grouping than the G7. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of these different regional groups are growing, and the growth in Asia is phenomenal. And what are we seeing in the West? Infrastructure breakdown, collapse of education, cultural degeneration. And if you're going to seriously challenge for world leadership, how do you do it if you have a generation of pot smokers who can't find their way around the corner? And that's to some extent where we are. And you see it in terms of the leadership. Each step of leaders has been a step down. You know, if you may remember Helmut Schmidt, the German leader, Helmut Kohl, who wasn't so great, but he was head and shoulders above what we have now, Schroeder. Then there was Merkel. I mean, the Germans now are looking to Merkel as the good old days. That's how bad it's gotten. And the same thing was going on in the United States, from Bush to Obama to Biden. And many people thought Trump was part of that downgrading also. But I think we're seeing something different with Trump, at least in terms of the geopolitical vision. And so there is hope, because, first of all, there's hope because in the developing sector, there's the spirit of Bandung, the non-aligned movement, the idea that finally we're going to get the colonial yoke off our necks and be able to develop a sovereign nation that will take care of its population. The question is
that BRICS? Would you say that BRICS, the politics of BRICS, is say the current manifestation of the legacy of the spirit of Bandung?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But what makes it powerful now is that China and Russia are part of it. And they're two of the three most powerful militaries in the world. China is arguably the most productive economy in the world. And so this is far beyond where they were with Bandung. With Bandung, they had good philosophy, good instincts, good desires, people like Nehru and Sukarno and so on. But they didn't have the physical economic power. Now, for the first time, they're developing that. China has better technological capacities than the United States now. And this is part of the game changer. So what does the US do? Do we try to downgrade them? Do we try to pull them down? Or do we recognize that we've been coasting, or not even coasting, we're going backwards? And we have to revitalize the classical science and art tradition of the West if we're going to develop the critical thinking that's necessary, not just to compete, but to get beyond competition. I was very impressed when Putin talked about the idea of a polyphony rather than a multipolar world. In other words, many voices in harmony. Now, that's sort of a dream that people have had for millennia. It's possible to do now, but not if you have people like Starmer and Macron and some of these characters, the Ursula von der Leyen, who's as nasty a person as you can find. I
don't know. I think she's got a lot of competition in Annalena Baerbock and whatever the woman's name is, Kaja Kallas or whatever.
Kallas, yeah.
That's a triplet. That's a triumvirate of evil there, if I've ever seen one. Let me ask you this.
Watch out if you see him on the street.
Oh yeah, I'm running. Lest they may cast a spell on me and turn me into a frog. But at any rate, let me ask you this though. Keir Starmer said something, implied something that gave me, in a paradoxical way, it gave me a bit of hope. We look at them and we're like, they're living in a dream world. They don't even understand reality. And so they said something about, Starmer said something about, taking back land from Russia. And Trump said, oh yeah, can you go try to take it back, right? And then he asked them, and Starmer just kind of looked around and he asked him, can you can you take on Russia by yourself? And Starmer was just kind of, that nervous that said, I know the answer to that. So for all of the bluster, we'll go out, we'll take down the Russians and blah, blah, blah. What you really see is when Trump pressed him on it, he knows the truth. He knows that at some point, if the Americans say, look, we ain't in anymore, he knows they don't have the horsepower to do anything, which in an odd way, I could argue that that's a good thing, because he may appear to be a complete lunatic, but he's not as stupid as he's acting. How about that?
Well, look at what they're trying to do. The whole point of the meeting Sunday in London was, first of all, to get Zelensky to issue an apology. And Zelensky did one of these non-apologetic apologies, like the kind I get from my 6-year-old daughter sometimes. She says, "I'm sorry, Papa," when you know she's not sorry.
Yeah, exactly. She just wants a cookie. And that's the way, right. That's the road to a cookie is, "I'm sorry, Papa." That's
right.
Believe me, I know it well.
Yeah. And then you look at the response from Starmer. As you point out, look, they're not completely insane, but they are hoping they can steer the United States. What's insane is their belief that Russia has to be stopped. Now, there's different reasons for different countries, but the central feature here is the British view of geopolitics, which was, again, was upgraded, you might say, by Brzezinski in his 1997 Global Chessboard, where he said that the real issue in the world for peace and stability is that you cannot have a rival to the West in Eurasia. And there's a rival to the West in Eurasia right now. It's the Eurasian perspective that Putin and Xi Jinping have put together. And it's based on physical economic development of an area with a large number of people, lots of resources, lots of potential that had been held back by the same colonial forces. China was dominated for almost 2 centuries by Western forces, especially the British. Remember the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1859. Russia was constantly attacked from the British Empire in the so-called Great Game. We know about the Crimea War, the fighting going on in Afghanistan, and so on. The Soviet Union, to some extent, was created, you might say, by Western bankers who wanted to see Russia and Germany in conflict. And that's the central issue of this geopolitical fight. The fear the British had was that if you had an equivalent of a transcontinental railroad in the United States connecting Western Europe with Eurasia, for example, the Vladivostok to the Atlantic Ocean Railroad, or the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, if you have those connections via land, it greatly reduces the power of the deep sea navy that the British had. And so they began to plan, how do you prevent this alternative from emerging? And this was drummed into generation after generation. So what evidence do we actually have that Putin intends to conquer Ukraine and then go into the Baltics? What's the evidence for that? You have people who hate Russia who will tell you that's what he's going to do. But anyone with military knowledge knows that if he really wanted to conquer Ukraine, he could have done it with the military power they have very quickly a long time ago. And so the idea that you have to go to the defense of Ukraine and build up a counterforce to Russia because Russia's about to reconstitute the Soviet Empire, that's nonsensical. It's preposterous. And yet that's the line that comes from every single one of these guys, especially the ones from the Baltic.
I'll say this. I don't know if you saw the opening of the Paris Olympics, but I think you'd have to go to war with the Russians to get them to take Europe, much less that they would want to take war. They'd probably fight to the death. You said, we're going to make Europe officially part of Russia. That's when you'd probably get nuked. Who the heck wants that place right now, led by the current lunatics that run it?
Lavrov refers to it as post-Christian Europe. And the Paris Olympic opening, you're exactly right. That gave paganism a bad name.
Exactly. Let me ask you this. there seems to be, interestingly enough, a growing, and this is apparently horrifying the current ruling class. And this is since we're talking about a potential paths to peace. The old Habsburg Empire seems like they're getting the band to get back together, as they said in the Blues Brothers. You know, there's a Central / Eastern European bloc that's coming together. With the Czechoslovakia seems to be this close to it. Of course, you've got Slovakia. You've an example. Slovakia and Hungary show that it's not ideological, because you've got a traditional conservative in Viktor Orban and a guy whose political legacy comes from the Soviet Union. He's a traditional socialist, right? These guys are traditionally supposed to hate each other and be opposed to everything. And they are 100% together with, hey, we just want peace. And we want our countries to be run the way the people vote for, and then to try to advance the interest and the economic interest of our people as a whole, which goes to show that's not an ideological issue. But you've got Romania. Well, they got to literally kidnap the guy to stop him from becoming president. Your thoughts on this growing, what can we call it, the Habsburg bloc, but this growing bloc that's coming together, and whether you could in a way connect that to the Habsburg Empire historically.
Well, I had the privilege of being in Budapest last week. I'd never been there. That's where my grandfather was from. It's a beautiful city. And what are they talking about there? They're talking about the potential of, once this war ends, of having the benefit of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative coming through Hungary, coming through Ukraine, bringing goods from Asia on high-speed rail. And high-speed rail for Americans is like a fantasy. It's like a Disney World thing. China has close to 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail right now. So you go into Eastern Europe, and what you see is countries that, somewhat like the global South, are beginning to find their own standing on their own 2 feet. Remember, these were countries that were under the Warsaw Pact, this part of the Soviet Empire. And in Hungary, 1956, you had a bloody revolution that was suppressed by the Soviet, the Red Army. It's interesting, Garland, because where I live now is the eastern part of Germany. And in the vote here, now Berlin is somewhat separate. Berlin is in the east, but it's kind of its own thing. But if you look on a map at the vote that just took place for the chancellor, the whole of the east is in blue, which is the alternative for Deutschland. And this is the area that used to be the Soviet area, which is now voting supposedly for right-wing extremists. What it tells you is that the political scientists are idiots, because this left-right division is a phony division. Because now you have the Democrats in the United States, who used to be considered left, against the war, against the FBI, against censorship, have completely flipped. So they're pro-war, pro-FBI, pro-interference by intelligence and censorship and so on. And the Republicans, who used to be considered the right wing, are now pro-Russian. They still haven't figured out the China question yet. And they certainly haven't figured out the Israel question. But you're seeing a dramatic shift in thinking. And this is characteristic, again, of the end of an era. And so what Putin was talking about all last summer in Sochi and Vladivostok and all these conferences is a tectonic shift in the world. There are countries that are beginning to establish themselves as sovereign nations. That's what you see with Fico in Slovakia and Orban in Hungary. Perhaps in the Czech Republic, we'll see something similar. Bulgaria even. And I'm hoping in Germany as well, because the German situation is going to be catastrophic. I don't know if you heard this, but Merz comes in, the candidate from BlackRock. Merz comes in, and Germany is suffering from a budget problem. It's got infrastructure collapsing. You hear of Germany, the great engineering and scientific tradition, and you don't see it. The trains don't run on time anymore. They may not even run in some cases. So what does Merz propose? A 400 billion euro increase in defense spending. At Starmer, the same thing. And I just saw the figures on the United Kingdom. 18% of the people in the United Kingdom live below the poverty level. 25% of the children live under the poverty level. In the 19th century, in Dickens' time, where we have Oliver Twist and so on, the population was 25% in the poverty level. So Britain's going back to the 1800s. And yet Starmer wants to give 2, 3, 4, 5 billion in new money to Ukraine for a war. So that's where you see the disconnect. And it's really quite obvious that there are people who have not yet figured out that the population is at some point going to rebel, as they have. Remember Sunak? Look what happened to him. He was gone in a minute. Liz Truss, gone in a minute. Starmer's heading in the same direction.
One of the other things that I think is interesting in as we strive towards a more peaceful existence is the collapse of the liberal class. In the United States, I saw a liberal class that at least faked, they used to fake the anti-war stuff. They used to do their best to pretend that amongst their ranks, they had a left flank that was anti-war, all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. And now they are fully, whatever you want to call it, neoconservative fascism, the Dick Cheneys, the John Boltons of the world, et cetera, right? And, I had a very good friend of mine. I don't know if you've seen any of my shows with Dr. Tony Montero, and he said something that just keeps ringing in my ears. And it is, you can't be the party of the people unless you're the party of peace, right? And I just thought about that in so many ways, particularly in the United States. Well, what you're saying also, let me add this, what you're saying in Europe also demonstrates that for this reason. War spending, so-called defense spending, but it's really war spending. That's money that could be used for, to keep people in their homes, to keep people from being impoverished, to build new roads, to keep the water flying, the trains on time, to keep, people working and employed and things of that nature. So the liberal class, I think part of the reason they collapsed is that when you become the party of war, you have to neglect the needs of the working class, the working poor, and the poor, to use all of that money for your, international imperial war machinations. And as the material needs of the everyday person decreases, they start looking for alternatives. Your thoughts on the collapse of the liberal class?
Well, and at that point, you need a police state and a surveillance state to stay on top of what's happening in the population. Look, there's a name for what's happening, and this is something that LaRouche introduced many years ago. You were talking about the anti-war movement. I was an anti-war activist in the late 60s, early 70s, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I couldn't find Vietnam on a map, but it was fun to march and do things like that. And then I ran into LaRouche, and he said, well, what is your alternative? What would you do differently? And he was putting forward this idea of physical economic development, which is not just a product of white Western culture, but is a characteristic of human creativity that exists in all people. And that's what we have to fight for. That's what he was saying at that time. And he then developed in 1975 a concept called an International Development Bank to replace the International Monetary Fund. And from that time forward, I've been fighting for this idea of sovereign nations developing for the interests of their population, but in cooperation with their neighbors. And then Helga Zepp-LaRouche, as you know from the Schiller Institute, introduced this concept of the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War in 1648. This is when Christians were killing each other, Catholics versus Protestants, Protestant sects versus other Protestant sects. They came up with this idea, which is basically the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And that's how nations should function, not meddling in others' affairs, but working together for a peaceful development, which is really the only way you can get a peace agreement. You can't, if there's a country you hate, you can't simply say, okay, let's put down our arms and have a kumbaya moment and then move on. That's the problem in the Middle East. you have to have an incentive for both sides to put away the hate, put away the idea of revenge and vengeance. And so, when you're looking at the world as it is today, you've got to have an economic component tied to a political component. The idea of just having a political agreement without mutual benefit doesn't work. And so that's the thing we have to fight for. Now, why is that so hard for people to see? Well, this is where you see the brainwashing of the get-rich-quick speculative economy. Again, you go back to the assassination of Kennedy as a turning point. Then 1971, Nixon ends the FDR Bretton Woods system, severs the relationship with the dollar to gold reserves. And then all of a sudden, speculators can come in and show how you can make a huge amount of money without producing anything. So-called financialization, derivative contracts, speculation, the Soros model. And you can accumulate enough money that you can buy political parties, buy politicians. And if someone wants to get ahead, they have to go along with that model. And so the idea that a solution to the US economy today is war and a tax cut, for example. Who does that benefit? As you were just saying, the smallest percentage of the billionaires and the millionaires who wish to be billionaires, and anyone else who's willing to claw and fight and try and become part of that. And the vast majority of the population sees themselves losing everything that their previous generations had fought to gain. And that's where you have the problem we have today. And that's why the establishment is smart about one thing, the need for a security state, a surveillance state, how they used 9/11, as Snowden points out, to gather metadata on every person, what you think, what you know, and figure out how to use social media to manipulate, minimally to break the ability to concentrate, but more importantly, destroy the cognitive powers that make us human. And so people start thinking, what's in it for me? What's the best thing for me? What can I get out of this? And that makes people very easy to control. That's how identity politics works.
One of the things that I think not one of the things, this is the manifestation of the problem here, the peace problem with the Ukraine conflict. There was a false narrative that was ahistorical. Everything, the color revolutions were ignored. The Budapest speech was ignored. The Maidan coup was ignored. And it became, let's start February of 2022. And the Russians just woke up one day and decided to invade.
Right off history completely.
Yeah, that's it. Just started they want to do. They're bad guys, it became this absurd business of good guys versus the bad guys, right? Okay. And what we have now is, to me, I could put it this way. When the Biden administration were wrested from power by the American people, you could argue. That was it for that narrative over here. It was done. The Trump administration, we are not into that narrative. It is what it is. As we can see by a number of things that they've taken, a number of actions they've taken as recently as last week. They would not sign on to a document that said, it was a Russian aggression, that they just, but it's ahistorical crap that was pushed by the Biden administration. Okay. The actions and the positions of the Macron-Starmer wing are based on that narrative. And the actions and positions based on the Trump team and include the Trump wing of NATO, if you want to call it that, the Fizos, etc., the Orbans is based on a historical context that says we got to take into context historically, this is what happened, and even a narrative. The two narratives, one of them doesn't face reality today. I mean, there was just an article in England in the British press that said, the Russians are ready to collapse. That, I guess next they'll have sanctions to sanction shovels and washing machines from Russia because that'll cut off their technological advantages, right? But we've got this narrative thing where the Americans are like, look, it is what it is. You're losing. Trump has been pretty blunt, like, dudes, you can't win this. And we got to have a talk with these guys to get peace, and we can't demonize. Okay, they don't like you, you don't like them, nobody likes anybody, but we can't get a deal if we just demonize everybody. To me, isn't it odd that Donald Trump, the person that we've told is a madman, his position, the positions of that wing of NATO are grounded in reality versus an absurd narrative? Is there a way to get around that narrative other than on the battlefield? The narrative will be proven, but more people have to die, and things just get more dangerous. Your thoughts on the narrative battle, reality versus a convenient invention of reality?
Well, there's my favorite Yiddish proverb, which is that the truth never dies, but it lives a miserable life. And the question is, who speaks for truth? And that's narrative is not truth. Narrative is a form of hybrid warfare, or soft power, you might say. And so the question that what was the narrative that led to the deployment against Russia in Ukraine? That Putin's actions with the special military operation was unprovoked. As you pointed out, that it all started in February 2022. Leaves out Maidan, leaves out the lies told to Gorbachev and then Yeltsin about NATO expansion, leaves out the effect of the shock therapy that was imposed on Russia that destroyed a generation and lowered the life expectancy and so on. Leaves out what was going on in the Donbass, leaves out the lies of the Minsk Accords from the West. You go through one after another. Now, here's the problem we have. Because of the power of the major media cartel, it's hard to get the truth through these narratives. And I'll tell you, one of the ways everyone knows it is the Russiagate story. Probably 40% of the population, according to the polls I've seen, still thinks that Putin intervened to help get Trump elected in 2016. And of course, you have Hillary Clinton saying at every chance she can, every time she can, Wasserman Schultz, the main media, they all still speak of that as though it's a holy truth, even though it's a complete lie.
If I may make one quick comment.
Yeah.
There was a Democratic member of Congress a few weeks ago, and he didn't even say, guess what he said? Well, Trump, Russia. Everybody knows about Trump, Russia, because Trump, Russia, Trump, all he would say is those two words, Trump, Russia. And it's that, and to me, here's what I thought of. I remember reading a book once on brain priming. Say the word over and over and over. Like if you can say a word over and over to yourself, you'll start believing it. Brain priming. He said, everybody knows about, quote, Trump, Russia, because Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia. So even then it seemed devious to me. It seemed diabolical because even then he knew I can't come out and say anything that I could be held accountable for, because now it would be pointed out that I'm lying. So I'll just throw this brain priming Trump, Russia thing out, and I can't be held accountable for saying anything wrong. So it's like, to me, you know what? You know you're lying. They know there's nothing there, but it's a convenient trope. You know, it's a rhetorical weapon now. Nothing more.
Well, you know, we in our movement experienced this with the attacks on Lyndon LaRouche, which came from the same networks that later on ran Russiagate. William Webster and Kissinger, using British documents, wanted to make sure that LaRouche had no influence on the Reagan administration, because he had some influence on the Reagan administration. So what do they say? He's a Nazi, he's a communist, he's an anti-Semite. And it was repeated over and over. He steals money from his contributors.
He's both far left and far right. Literally Wikipedia had a thing on Max Blumenthal, the gray zone, and it said they're both far right and far left at the same time, which is a very, very difficult task. I mean, it takes some talent to be that.
Well, and it takes some chutzpah to be able to tell those lies and get away with it. Chutzpah and control of the mass media.
Yes.
And that's the problem. We're up against one of the conglomerates, corporate conglomerates, is the mass media. And the ability to break that, and I'm very impressed. I know you've been working on this for years. You look at things like the gray zone, you look at the success that Judge Napolitano's had, and the people who he has on are people who are telling much closer to the truth, and in many cases, the absolute truth. And they're getting a breakthrough. because people are getting tired of the narrative. And where the narrative breaks down, for example, in Ukraine, we were told Ukraine can win. Russia doesn't have the staying power. It doesn't have the money. It doesn't have the personnel. Its army is poorly trained. And yet what's happened in that war? Well, reality is that Ukraine cannot win. And ultimately, you should be able to figure this out. A nuclear power will not be defeated by a non-nuclear country if that nuclear power believes its very survival depends on winning the war. So why is it they keep getting these things wrong? And every once in a while you see a show on what did we get wrong here? It's all the assumptions, the presumptions, or what better is called axioms, the axiomatic beliefs that somehow the West is superior because of why. Well, we know the most extreme form of that was the Nazis and eugenics. And that still exists below the surface. That's one of the reasons people are freaked out about China. There's an element of racism there. It's one of the reasons people are freaked out about the growing population of Africa, the same kind of belief structure. So how do you break that? Well, you break it by telling the truth and by becoming more increasingly ironical and getting people to laugh at the silly stuff they believe in. The idea that Sir Keir Starmer is going to ride to the rescue, when in fact, you could make the case that he's made his career by protecting the British aristocracy from charges of pedophilia. So is that the moral character of the leader of the West? So, I think there are ways to go after this. And this is one of the things that got LaRouche in trouble. He was very honest. He didn't hold back. And I think we have to do that also. And of course, that's part of Trump's success. Whether you agree with him on everything or not, he'll say what he believes. There's an authenticity there. And he may be completely off on some things, but he doesn't mind changing his view if he figures out what he was saying was wrong. And he touched this anti-establishment chord in so many American people that people like Hillary Clinton and Podesta and others had basically said it's because the American people are stupid. Now, how do you win elections if you say the people are stupid?
Well, here's the thing about it. It becomes obvious that the current liberal class, we'll call them, right, that they have nothing but contempt for regular old working class people.
Yeah.
It's why did Kamala lose? Well, because the voters were too stupid to vote for her. Oh, they're going to get what they got. You know what I mean? Why why won't you listen to me? We need to punish. You need to punish these people because they need to be brought to heel, and that's what that seems to be again the totalitarian mindset. Let me ask you this:
it's arrogance.
Yeah.
The arrogance of the establishment really grates on people's nerves. Being lectured to.
I wanted to ask you a question. One of the things that I thought was critical is that when I'm listening to the Trump campaign, and listen to the Donald Trump with this, dust up, shall we say, with Zelensky the other day, right? And this stuck to mind. Words mean something. And he said, we want peace. They don't want peace. We want peace. He said, they're gambling with people's lives. You're gambling with World War III. Then afterwards, I listened to his surrogates. And what were they saying? We want peace. The man doesn't want peace. We're trying to get peace. Literally using the word peace, a word that you don't hear that word coming out of the mouths of people who run the U.S. empire. Unless it's we want a piece of that country and a piece of this country, the piece they want, right? Let's piecemeal this country up so everybody gets a piece of it. But I found that interesting. Now, we shall see over the long run. Granted, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is the second coming of Gandhi by any stretch of the imagination, right? We can criticize him in Gaza and in Venezuela, Cuba, all the things. But it's a good sign, at least, when you have a president that says, what's the problem do you have with that guy? He doesn't want peace, and I want peace. He doesn't want to end the war. I want to end the war. And now I turn on the news and they're all over him. Oh, terrible Donald Trump. What a horrible guy he is. Your thoughts on the importance of the language of a president to say, I want peace. And then his surrogates know that's the word they got to use all the time. So you hear it from Tulsi Gabbard, you hear it from RFK Jr., you hear it from all of his surrogates, the importance of that. And one other thing I got to add, Donald Trump's followers are very, very loyal. They kind of hang on his word. You know, there's an element, there's an element of his people who voted for Trump. I know some who don't even like Donald Trump. Yeah. But they were so hopeless with the Biden administration, any port in a storm, as we say in the voting world, right? But there's an element that really listens to Trump. And when Trump says peace, I want peace, I'm for peace, that thought will inculcate itself into the MAGA world. And he could literally turn the MAGA world into people who say we want peace to some extent, with maybe some few holes in it. But anyway, your thoughts on that, the importance of that kind of rhetoric.
Well, our mutual friend, Dennis Speed, wrote a report this morning on the aftermath of the Friday showdown in the White House. And he made a point. He said that in all the coverage, one of the things that is most left out is when Trump said, you're risking World War III.
Right.
And this is something that will stick in people's minds. World War III, the president is saying we're headed toward World War III, that Zelensky's taking us to World War III, that you're playing with people's lives. And I think you're absolutely right, Garland. That will stick. And you see it in terms of the unwillingness of the opponents of Trump to address that. What do they address instead? The heroism of Zelensky, the barbarism of the Russians. But they don't talk about this question of this resistance to a negotiated settlement, which, look, Biden and under the control of Blinken, they wouldn't even talk to Putin. 3 years, no conversations. We kept saying, you have to negotiate, you have to have diplomacy. Even if you don't have an agreement, talk. They wouldn't do it. And that's the power of language. And if you read the speeches of Putin at these various conferences, or Sergei Lavrov, who's a very straight talker, and then compare it with someone like Blinken. You know, Blinken goes to the Middle East and says to Netanyahu, we want you to be more humanitarian while you're killing Palestinian children. They don't see the contradiction in the language. And it passes by so much of the population. If someone points it out, how humanitarian is it to give 2,000-pound bombs to someone who's going in and dropping them indiscriminately on a population while you're supposedly hunting down terrorists? That's why this idea you can't make it up. Some of what they present as their narrative, if it's taken apart properly, in simple language, exposes the fraud. And when Trump said that repeatedly, and Vance also to Zelensky, why don't you want peace? Is peace bad? Because that's what you get when you listen to Zelensky. Well, peace means we're giving in to Putin. No, it doesn't. It means you're stopping the war. And I think that's where the pro-peace side has missed an opportunity to make those points. But now that we have the president saying it becomes much more clear. And as you point out, people who support Trump will try and figure out why they should be supporting him even more now because of this idea of peace, as opposed to taking tax dollars and using it to kill young people.
Yeah, I can oppose, as you know, when people have said you support, what's happened? I'll put it like this: one of the things that's happened in the U.S. in the media, as far as rhetoric, is the discussion is an absence of policy, and it becomes the politics of personality. That's the whole Putin thing. That's why there's no such country as Russia. It doesn't exist. There's only Putin. There's no Russian government. There's only Putin. Putin bombed this. Putin attacked this. Putin did this. There's never a discussion of you create this demon called Putin, and then you only use that word. The same thing here. You support Trump or you don't support Trump. And what I always say is this: just like any other president. If he does something, if this administration does something that I support, I'll get behind it. If they do something I don't support, I'll push back on it. That is smart. That is wise. That is saying I have a set of principles as a person, and I judge politicians based on my own principles. What we're taught is you have to be opposed to the politician or in favor of the politician or the party. Therefore, now everything that politician does. That's why you have people who reflexively, when Donald Trump gets in an argument with someone, because Donald Trump wants a peaceful settlement and they don't, the person reflexively says, well, of course I support the other guy. I don't know who is it. I don't know. I don't really care, but he's against Trump. That's kind of where we've gotten. Is that the same dynamic that's been brought about in Europe?
Oh, sure. I mean, the demonization of Putin is unbelievable. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, the gymnast who turned into a foreign minister, she gave a speech in the Bundestag 2 days ago where she just said, we can't let the Russian barbarians overrun Europe. Now, no one in the Bundestag stood up and said, what the hell are you talking about? Partly because the Alternative for Deutschland is not even allowed into the Bundestag sometimes when Baerbock is speaking. So they control the narrative to that extent. And I'll bring this up in terms of Germany. The AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is identified as an extremist organization. And they do have some people who are kind of out there on the immigration question, for example, who do agree, throw them all out. But the idea that it's a Nazi party, their whole campaign platform was peace, ending the war, working with Putin, a normalization of relations. Some of them even go so far as to say that Germany should be the bridge between the United States and Russia for working with the BRICS. So how is that right-wing extremism? They disagree on climate. They think that CO2 is a fraudulent issue. Germany's economy has been collapsed because of the sanctions on Russian oil and gas, the Nord Stream pipeline blown up, shutting down nuclear power, the carbon dioxide fanaticism, the attack on the internal combustion engine. That's destroying the German economy. But if you speak against it, you're what, an extremist? So that's how this works, Garland. You name someone an extremist. You say they're out there, they're far right or far left, and then you don't have to have a discussion. And that protects people from thinking. And there's a very interesting book called The Battle for the Mind by William Sargent, which lays this out. And this is what hybrid warfare is. And this is why it's so interesting. Again, whether you agree with Musk on everything or not isn't the point. What he's doing to go after the U.S. Agency for International Development is quite interesting because on the one hand, we're told they're a humanitarian organization, and they do provide some food aid, some vaccines, certain other things, but there are strings attached, quite important strings attached. And then on top of that, they're involved with the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA, and other non-governmental organizations in color revolutions. How is that humanitarian? Well, Samantha Power, who is the head of USAID, talks about the responsibility to protect. Who are they protecting? They're protecting the ruling class, the imperial power, by saying that when a country votes for someone different than they want, that's meddling. It's wrong. So again, this language question is important. The understanding of history is important. And I would say on top of that, understanding physical economy, that the way you solve these problems is you create the ability to produce new value in a physical process, manufacturing and so on, as opposed to a monetary policy, producing money, bailouts and things of that sort. You put these things together and it would be simple, as Mrs. Eplerouche is saying, it would be simple to get agreements, but people don't have access to that information. So we've got to keep fighting, but I think we're on an upswing right now because this whole situation has exposed the fallacies and the frauds of the other side.
I think there's something that you brought up that I have to get you to comment on, and it's a critical part of this discussion if you're moving towards peace. Again, Elon Musk, perfect example for me. Oh, I can be, dancing in the streets that he is, disassembling USAID and National Endowments for Democracy. And in fact, I'll say this: for the things and the positions that Donald Trump is currently taking, I don't think it's an accident that they went after USAID first, that they had to to use a neocon term, they had to launch a decapitation strike on USAID because that machine was going to come after him. When he started saying, I want peace, he knew that machine, like a battleship, it was going to turn all of its turrets starboard and face them towards Donald Trump. And every article, every website, everything from Washington, D.C. to Finland was going to go after Donald Trump 24 hours a day because they were all funded by USAID all over the world, that machine. And they had to decapitate that machine in order to have a chance to do the things that he's trying to do, particularly peace with Russia. But again, I can say, look, there's regular old working class people working for the Department of the Interior and CMS and, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Service and these other things. And as a person who advocates for the working class, I don't want a single working class person fired or laid off ever, right? That's going to be my position. But I can still say, hooray, you took out USAID. They had to go down. Again, we have to nuance these things. So I don't have to hate or love Musk. I can evaluate the various things that he does. But here's my point. This USAID, this machine, it was supranational. This wasn't the US government. This wasn't the British government. This was this thing, because we found out that, I will guarantee you this, when Corbyn was taken out, USAID was all over that. When Donald Trump was impeached, USAID was all over that. When anything evil happens, USAID was all over that. It didn't matter what country. If evil works needed to be done, USAID was right there in the midst of it, making it happen, and they had $40 billion to do it. So your thoughts on the crippling effect that has on this supranational monster, regime change, neoliberal, neoconservative monster?
Well, you're right to point out to the international octopus tentacles of USAID. In fact, I just wrote an article on it that's posted up on the LaRouche organization website under Harley's blog that people can go to, because it was actually closer to $60 billion a year.
Wow.
Because a lot of the money they have is because they work through I think there are hundreds of organizations that have contracts with USAID. So you don't know where all the money's going. It's sort of like the money going to Ukraine. All of a sudden they find $100 billion didn't show up somewhere. Where did it go? So this is a classic way of covering your tracks. But what's important is that, just to take a case study, when it became clear that Orban was not going to knuckle under to the NATO European Union policy on Ukraine, Samantha Power shows up in Budapest with money to promote democratization of media, to try and create YouTube channels for the opposition, to recruit young people to become talk show hosts, to present alternative ideas. But what is that the business of the US government? To go in and find opponents to a government and fund them and set them up as an operation. That's what the tactic of color revolution is. How can you facilitate an overthrow of a hostile government, a government hostile to the policies of the blob, of the unipolar order? How do you finance it and do it in a way that's covered up? Well, that's what Maidan was. That's what Ukraine was. Only in the Ukraine coup in 2014, Victoria Nuland was in the street handing out cookies. At the same time, she was overseeing $5 billion going to the opposition to get rid of Yanukovych, the democratically elected president of Ukraine. And I'll tell you, Garland, one of the things that really irks me is when I hear, well, but Zelensky was elected. How can you do this to him? Well, so was Yanukovych. And Yanukovych was overthrown with money from US taxpayers. to bring in an organized crime figure, Poroshenko, to carry out an assault against the Russian ethnic population in eastern Ukraine. And there were 14,000 of them killed. They were Ukrainians. They may have spoken Russian, but they were Ukrainians. It was, in a sense, a civil war. So when you parse these things down and look at them, you get a clear sense of what we're talking about, how language is used to subvert the ability to have critical thinking.
I think you're right. That is the information war, and then without that, it changes the entire equation worldwide. You know, there are people saying, "Okay, Trump wants to do this just so he can go after China." We don't know. First of all, we don't know that. Secondly, how about we get this war stopped, and then we can worry about China? How about we focus on the current, trying to get peace in Gaza? The idea that, well, I can't support the people who are trying to stop this conflict because either they're doing something that I don't like otherwise, or when they get this conflict, they'll do something else. To me, it's an excuse. To me, the people who are in favor of peace, you've got to be able to sometimes ally with people that you disagree with. You know, Frederick Douglass said, "I will ally with anyone for good," but I think he said, like, with any man for evil and for good, and no man for evil. And I think that's the other thing that which is a good thing out of desperation over the last few years that I've seen, and that is people who don't have maybe a cultural, maybe a rhetorical, political, religious, ideological alignments, people who don't agree on so many things, but are now able to come together and say, but we can make sense on this issue. Let's work together on this issue. I think that's something that's really good that I've seen come of this conflict in the current day time we're in.
Well, that's the idea Mrs. Eplerouche had of the International Peace Coalition. Whether you're right, left, libertarian, whatever, if you're for peace, let's get together and have a discussion. And, this could have been done earlier. If you go back to 2008, 2009, when you had the bailout, you had the Obamacare, you had the Tea Party, and you had Occupy Wall Street. These two groups, so-called left and right, had a lot in common and could have maybe stopped the bailout, could have done something to change things. And instead, they went by these profiles. And as a result, that's one of the ways they've always stopped this. What's happening with Trump is we're seeing former Democrats who are going to Trump. You see Trump.
Well, I'm not exactly going to Trump, but I'm a former Democrat who've gone away from the Democrats. How are we saying?
Well, that's, yeah. Who on an issue by issue basis will look and see what's right and what's not right. And I think that's really what should define politics in this country. Issues, thoughts, ideas. Suppose we get a peace agreement on Ukraine, and then you mentioned Gaza, we've got China. We've got a lot to deal with, but what's the dark cloud in the background? The London Economist had an article yesterday saying that the U.S. economy is headed toward the rocks on a number of areas, including bonds, including debt. How are you going to deal with this debt problem that's closing in on $40 trillion? So there are a lot of things that have to be resolved. You can't resolve them by hating someone who disagrees with you.
And you have to stop the war in front of you. You know what I mean? You got to stop the war in front of you. There are people who make legitimate arguments that the drive to war is driven by financial desperation, right? I agree with that, right? Yeah. But that doesn't do you no good if you don't stop the war in front of you. You can address these financial issues. You can push for changes in whatever. I don't care what kind of revolution you want, ideological, political, economic, you name it. You can push for all of those. But you can't do it if you're dead. That's the problem.
And if you have a nuclear war, especially.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the point I'm getting at. Go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah. So right now, you have people who are on a drive towards a nuclear war. You know, what's interesting is this. I made this point. We're just about out of time, but I made this point. During the election, I said the Biden administration, by policy, my dad used to have an old saying, even when you win, you lose, right? As a joke, right? But it applies sometimes, right? But here's my point. By policy, the Biden administration was, we want to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Russia's nuclear policy that says very specifically, if we get a strategic defeat, we're going to nuke you, as does all nuclear powers, right? So they're by policy,
And they make it
they
clear.
got what they yes, and by policy, and it's also, we don't want that to happen, but we will. So by policy, it was, we want to achieve a goal. And if we achieve our goal, every human being on this earth will die. And that's where the Brits are. That's where Macron and Starmer right now. We've got to keep fighting, no matter what. Well, you know where this ends. You're not, let's pretend out where this ends. You all die. You want us to go. You want the Americans to come in. Then obviously you're going to put all your troops in, all 12 of them. They'll be killed by one Iskander missile blast about an hour after they arrive. As soon as the Russians figure they're there, in comes probably a drone. They won't waste an Iskander missile on 12, soccer hooligans, which is about all the Brits have for a military now. Yeah. So they'll be dead in 15, 20 minutes. Then what the Brits want is, then the Americans will rush in, go to war on Russia's border, which means they'll be vaporized by a couple of Orishniks in about an hour. And then we have a nuclear war and we all die. That is the obvious outcome of that. Okay, it seems to me that, and you see people do these things, something in life, something is so horrifying to them that it's tantamount to death. And it seems to me that the obvious end of the British Empire, that there are people in Britain that would rather die and take all of us with them.
Well, I think that's the problem. And what Trump did on Friday was make it clear 2 or 3 times that it's a danger of World War III. You'd rather have a nuclear war than a peace. And we're offering you an agreement. And what Trump is saying is what Putin told Biden, which is that we want mutual security guarantees, not just for Russia. But he was trying to get across the point that Russia has legitimate security concerns. Now, anyone who's over 50 years old, maybe 60 years old, remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were prepared to go to war with Russia, with the Soviet Union, to get these nuclear weapons out of Cuba. So why don't we understand why Russia feels threatened if you put NATO weapons on the borders of Russia? So again, it's the lack of historical knowledge, the inability to make an analogy. But whatever it is, Trump cut through that when he said, you're willing to risk World War III, and I'm not. And the American people won't go along with that. And that was a profound, it wasn't just a slap down of Zelensky. It was a moment of real politics, real statecraft. And I think it's something we can build on in the expectation that the normalization of relationships will go beyond just stopping the war. Stopping the war is crucial. But once you do that, then you now have the basis for economic cooperation on climate, on asteroids coming at us, things of that sort. You have a whole area where we can use the best of all nations to solve problems of all mankind. And to sabotage that for the sake of the ego of giving a bloody nose to Putin in Ukraine shows how little the thinking is of the people who are behind this war.
Yeah, I think at some point the Starmer, I call it the green eggs and ham strategy, is going to run out, because that's what it is. There was a little, for people don't know, listening might not know, there was a famous Dr. Seuss books for kids. And he'd ask the guy the same question over and over. And will you eat green eggs and ham? No. Will you eat them in a train? No. On a plane? No. Will you eat them and it was just like, I'm asking you, will you send troops to Ukraine? No. Will you send them on a plane? No, I will not send them on a train. I will not send. So at some point, Starmer and Macron are going to get to the point where they're saying, will you send troops? And Trump's going to be some kind of way, get the message to him. The answer, don't ask me again. Dude, I think Trump realistically should say to Macron and Starmer, if you ask me that question again, I will consider it an insult. I think he's going to have to take the picture because every other day they have another meeting, and Trump they fly to DC, and Trump says, "Nah, not sending troops and planes." Okay, then they send Zelensky. Nope, not sending troops and planes. Then they go back and they have a meeting. Oh, great, we've got a plan. What is it? The U.S. will send troops and planes. Now they'll probably be heading back to Trump. We've got a totally different meeting than we got a plan. It's nothing like the old one. You're going to love this one. This one only involves sending not troops and planes, planes and troops. How about we go with that one? And at some point, Trump's going to have to say, no, don't ask me again. I will be insulted if you ask me again. The answer is no. You guys are going to have to come up. Now, I don't know if they'll ever get it or whatever.
You know what they're ultimately afraid of, Garland?
What?
They're afraid that if they do push too far, Trump will pull troops out of NATO. Will pull the United States.
That's what he should threaten. No, threaten. He should start doing it. He should say, you know what? I'm going to come to that Romanian base, you guys. You know what? Every time you ask me, again, I'm taking 25,000 troops out. That's what he should say. Every time you ask me that question. But how about this? I'm taking 25,000 troops out just because I'm insulted. And from now on, every time you ask me, I'm taking 25,000 more out. To me, that's the only thing that might shut their yaps.
Well, and the question that he could also pose is, why did we keep NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union? This is so-called defensive alliance. Why is this defensive alliance trying to deploy into the South China Sea?
Here's the other good thing about these eggheads that don't seem to get it, that ask the same question over and over. This is good. They're forcing the question about NATO. You know what I mean? If they simply accepted this and said, okay, go ahead and do what you got to do, they could avoid the question that you're bringing up. Every time they push it a little further, those of us who say, what the heck is NATO still? What is this fossilized war machine still doing? We get a little bit louder and a few more people join our ranks. Now you go online, the whole MAGA world is starting to say, let's get out of NATO. So I hate to continue to use this word, paradoxically, the best thing that could, the most pronounced thing that could get rid of NATO are these lunatics that they're not saying get rid of NATO. Here's what they're doing. They're proving that NATO is not only a military, it's not a military alliance, that it is a burden to the United States and a danger to the world.
And it's an example of what's called hybrid warfare, where you try to win the war without using weapons because they don't have the weapons.
Yeah. They don't have a lot of other options. You're right about that. Right. I don't think their grand rhetoric is going to work against hypersonic missiles for some reason.
I don't think so.
No, but luckily for us, we're moving in a direction where hopefully, I'll say this: I think Donald Trump should do something. One of the things I think he could do. This is the last thing I'll get your thought on, because I know we're over time. One of the things that Donald Trump could do is say, I'm going to take concrete action, such as we're going to start flights between the U.S. and Moscow again, and pick a lump of sanctions, banks, SWIFT, these things done. They're over with. To take some concrete action, because sometimes knuckleheads, the only thing they understand is reality, and maybe the only thing they would get, maybe as long as Trump doesn't do something like that, they'll have some glimmer of hope that they can pull him back into the Biden camp. But if he does something concrete that sends the message once and for all, game's over. I think that's going to be necessary.
Well, I think it will happen, because there's already discussion about removing some of the sanctions, discussion about cooperation in the Arctic. This is an area where, you don't need to take over Greenland if you have cooperation. The Russians have this fleet of nuclear icebreakers. We don't have that. If we really are serious about developing that area, they would come in handy. So that there are concrete areas where they can work together in the process of ending this hostility. But the first step, think about this, on February 12th, when it was announced that Trump and Putin had a 90-minute discussion. That's when the hysteria really got set off. How could you talk to this man? And how could you be happy about it?
Yeah, well, I think we're moving in a good direction. We still got a bumpy road ahead of us, but we've a long ways from where we were on January 19th.
That's right.
I was
That's
kind of convinced that if Harris won, which I knew there was no prayer of that, but if that had happened, we were all in deep and serious trouble. Thank you very much, Harley Schlanger. Tell everybody where they can go to find all your good works.
Well, the place to go is the LaRoucheOrganization.com or the Schiller Institute. And I'd like to encourage people every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern, we have a Zoom call where we bring together people from all over the world to talk about just what Garland and I have been discussing. How do you get to peace? What's the process? And this is the idea of the Peace of Westphalia, of opposites having discussions and working things out, including last week we had Israeli and Palestinians on the call. So every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, you can find a link at the Schiller Institute. And my work, you go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com, you'll find a link where it says Harley's Daily Update. I do a 10 to 12 minute video update where I try to incorporate history and these kinds of questions with current events. So to hopefully give people some kind of footing in the real world.
Well, we shall continue to work together towards peace. I'm asking all 610 current viewers right now. Number one, hit the like button. Number two, subscribe. Number three, if you can join, that's great. If you can't, that's okay. Share this on all your social media platforms. That is critical. That is something you can do to help work towards peace. You're in the chat, and a lot of people get in the chat and comment. That's great. Appreciate it. That ain't enough, but there is something you can do. I'm sure you've got, whether it's Telegram or X or Facebook or wherever, I'm sure you have a social media outlet somewhere that you use other than this. So share this, post this, make recommendations for people to watch this. I think it was a great video, and we will continue to work towards peace. Thank you very much. We're out.